raised as a military brat, so I kind of bounced around everywhere. Graduated high school, and I already spent 2 years in Texas, in San Antonio, and my sister was attending Texas A&M. So I was like, why don't I go to Texas A&M? Graduated in 2011 with a degree in history and a minor in business. And at the time, I was not intending to go to DC at all. I wanted to be in the Forest Service, so until I got my first internship on the Hill. And that's really what started me on the path that I'm on now. I had no clue what the Hill was about before I became an intern, and it was unpaid, which eventually led to a paid internship. And eventually, through a few steps, that landed me with Dr. Burgess's office. And then I spent 7 years with him. So I did 2.5 years as correspondence manager, doing some policy stuff. And then eventually that led to being a legislative assistant and eventually his energy policy advisor. So about 6-7 months ago, I left his office and joined the small energy firm that I work for now, Coefficient. We are a consulting advocacy lobbying organization that it primarily focuses on electricity markets, but also handles waste. And we're doing a lot of stuff in the methane realm right now. So with all the stuff happening in the energy space, with what's going on in the energy markets, specifically in Europe, as well as climate space, there's just a lot of things going on. So it's a really interesting place to be. So that's a good question. So I think, number one, I just kind of fell into it. It wasn't intentional. And I think there are some people who their dream is to be a lobbyist. I was never one of those people. And I know a lot of people who are in this space who never really intended to be a lobbyist. And maybe they see lobbying as a way to transition. So a lobbying gives me that experience of gaining to learn and understand about the energy sector in a new way that is more hands-on than I was on the Hill, where on the Hill, it is, I don't want to say it's academic, but it's much more 30,000 foot view. You're trying to get the understanding of the markets, understanding of the policy, and a lot of it is political more than actually operational. And so just, I view it as, I'm taking this step as a way to learn more about the sector at large, not so much as I've always wanted to be a lobbyist.
What's the distinction between interest groups and lobbyists? So how would you explain the relationship between interest groups and lobbying?
It's an ecosystem, right? So it's not interest groups can hire lobbyists, but lobbyists can also be solo entrepreneurs, right? They can work for themselves. So I work for a small firm and we have multiple clients, and we're setting up these various alliances that they do their own advocacy. And so I think that's a good opportunity to kind of step back and just think about what lobbying is, right? And a lot of people think that lobbying is just throwing wads of cash at politicians, and it's not. I think there's a big difference between what lobbying is and what lobbyists are, right? Like the role of being a lobbyist versus what lobbying is. Lobbying can be picking up the phone and calling your local representative and telling them that the school crossing needs a new light. Like you contacting your government and asking for a change in investment, in policy, in regulation. That is lobbying, no matter whether you're paid or not. And so, that's protected by the First Amendment, that everybody can do that. And as somebody who actually ran the correspondence of Dr. Burgess's office for a good 2.5 years, receiving between 40 to 80,000 pieces of mail a year, a lot of people are lobbying the government and they just don't even realize it. They're reaching out to their congressman and they just don't even view that as lobbying, but it is. Then you have lobbyists, right? Where lobbyists are professionals who, through some degree of experience or understanding of the process, maybe they know some people, they have the ability to reach out to folks in the government, either on the Hill, the House, the Senate, or in the regulatory bodies. They might be reaching out to the White House, they might be reaching out to an agency, whether it's Health and Human Services, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, all the various agencies within that. They understand this is an outcome that is impacting some of my clients. Like basically people will go and hire these folks who have a understanding where the policies are and who the right people are to talk to, and they pay them to make those connections for them. And
I think your knee jerk on that one of them was, which one was it?
Super omega rich guys. That was funny. If you're talking about comparing it to minimum wage, lobbyists do get paid better than that. But usually you can be a lobbyist with 1 year of experience and you're barely breaking even in the DC area, right? The DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area is one of the most expensive regions in the country, maybe behind LA, San Francisco. And like when I was younger in my early 20s, I knew lobbyists who were also in their early 20s who they lived with 3-4 other people. And so even though they might have been making $50,000, $60,000 in the DC area, that's not much. So maybe by national standards, they might have high salaries, but I think there is, if you are somebody who understands the process and can bring value to your clients, the people who are actually like paying you to go do X or Y or Z, and you can actually get results, then that is something that a lot of people find valuable. And a lot of people kind of think of it as a lobbyist gives money to a politician and that politician votes to give government money to the client, right? That is usually not how that happens. Typically, it is much more akin to a client is honestly like afraid of a new regulation coming out and they don't really understand it. They don't know the process. They don't know who to talk to, and they want more information. They want to know when to expect certain things. They want some certainty in what those decisions might be. And a lot of the regulatory process can be pretty opaque. And so you generally go to your lobbyist as like a middleman of somebody who has exposure or understanding of that process, whether it's congressional or regulatory, to connect the dots for you so that you have a better understanding on what to expect. There's also different types of lobbyists. And you can probably hear my daughter in the background, so apologize for that. There's a lobbyist. So there are lobbyists who are the more what people assume they are, the networking kind, where it's more about who you know, running fundraisers, fundraising for specific candidates and helping them win their elections. That's what I would consider the networking or political lobbyists. And then you have what I would consider more policy experts, the folks who they understand forward and backward the Nuclear Policy Act or the National Environmental Policy Act or something like that. Whether it's healthcare, defense, transportation, there are these experts that have enough experience to know where, like what specific part of the regulatory code that they need to look at to find the definition of tire iron. Like that's probably a bad example, but there's all these definitions and there's all these intricacies of the regulatory process. Yeah. So, and I'm going to take that question and kind of expound on that. So it's a spectrum, right? Like it's very different every day, but there's also different types of lobbyists. And you can probably hear my daughter in the background, so apologize for that. Good. There are different types of lobbyists. So there are lobbyists who are the more what people assume they are, the networking kind, where it's more about who you know, running fundraisers, fundraising for specific candidates and helping them win their elections. That's what I would consider the networking or political lobbyists. And then you have what I would consider more policy experts, the folks who they understand forward and backward the Nuclear Policy Act or the National Environmental Policy Act or something like that. Whether it's healthcare, defense, transportation, there are these experts that have enough experience to know where, like what specific part of the regulatory code that they need to look at to find the definition of tire iron. Like that's probably a bad example, but there's all these definitions and there's all these vaccination policy. I'm probably not the person to go talk to. And so the networks are not so much about just like knowing somebody and like giving them a favor. It's understanding that this person is an expert in X policy and they can help you, like from a staffer perspective, from a congressional perspective, it is that expertise that is really, really valuable, or the connection to somebody who is an expert.
The bill becomes a law, that the overseeing agency, like whatever federal bureaucracy that has oversight over that law's implementation. I think that most people don't really know that the regulations like that you were just discussing, that the federal agency themselves can go through and reformulate how the bill is, or what the law was entailing. And so I wondered how much of that, like, because you're mentioning it, like how much does that play into a role? So you help follow the bill in Congress, but then after it becomes law, then like what's that process look like?
Yeah. Well, and that's it, it's funny because a lot of people will press for the passage of legislation. There's a lot of political will to do that. And I'm thinking in terms of climate change, there's been a lot of bills that have passed this past Congress that impact the energy and environment provisions in the law, and specifically the energy sector in the overall economy. And after it's passed, a lot of people just forget that it was passed and needs to be enacted. And they're like, okay, what's the next big thing I need to go and get enacted in the law? Because they forget about the regulatory side of it. They forget that this actually needs to get done rather than just signed on the dotted line, right? There's one thing of getting a piece of paper signed by the president and actually turning that into money rolling out the door, action, something like that. So that is the regulatory system that you're talking about. And that takes a while, right? Like it can, so it depends on what it is, but it can take from a few months to over a year to go from the enactment of a bill to actually getting action in the ground, or in the bureaucracy or regulatory system. And it depends on the agency. It depends on what the law says. And like you said, like the regulatory agencies have some discretion in how they enact some things. They have some discretion in how they define certain things, unless Congress says otherwise. And I think this has been brought up by a lot of people, that Congress has delegated its authority to the executive branch, in that it just doesn't want to write very tight laws. And it depends on what it is, but a lot of times, both for political expediency, it's easier in terms of time and effort to get a bill passed without getting into the really weeds and the hard stuff of a lot of this stuff. And then the regulatory bodies do it, and then Congress can complain. So it's a big process, and each agency has their own different culture, has their own different processes. They all have to publicly announce the timing of a lot of these things. So there's a lot of free resources that a lot of people just don't know how to use. Federal Registrar, Congress.gov, that you can easily monitor these things. You just need to go look for them.
Okay. Well, in closing, what is maybe like what's your favorite story about your new position, and what you love or hate about it, or whatever anecdote that you feel like would be like a lasting impression?
Sure. So I think, like I said, there are a lot of different types of lobbyists. So I think, like I said, there are a lot of different types of lobbyists, right? And I really appreciate that I'm surrounded by people who are experts and that they really know the energy and climate space. And we're a bipartisan firm, so we have Republicans. I work for a Republican for a long time, but we have Democrats on staff. And we try to keep it pretty balanced, because that is, from our view, that is the best way to affect pragmatic change, is to really try to reach out to both sides of the aisle and do what's best for our long-term vision, which is, there's a lot of people who will disagree with me on this, but in my view, the climate issue is one that needs to be addressed, but doing so through pragmatic action, supporting free markets, supporting innovative new technologies without these massive regulatory apparatuses. That's a much better way to do it. And so I really like being part of something that's actually changing, hopefully changing people's minds and actually enacting real change to make our current system better, right? It's not just about, we don't have to change anything. And it's not just about, we need to completely rip everything out of the ground and replace it. history. Our clients can choose us, and we can choose our clients. So it's a really very interesting space to be.
That you
Sure.
feel like would be like a lasting impression?
Sure. Like I said, there are a lot of different types of lobbyists, right? And I really appreciate that I'm surrounded by people who are experts and that they really know the energy and climate space. And we're a bipartisan firm, so we have Republicans. I work for a Republican for a long time, but we have Democrats on staff, and we try to keep it pretty balanced because that is so. One of the things that really popped out to me was one of I basically got a gist of there were some of your students that just didn't know what lobbying was. Hopefully this helped with that. There are people who might feel cynical towards lobbying, which totally understand that. And there were a few that really stuck out to me that they made it seem like it was a very exclusive thing to do. And it can be, but like I said, lobbying is things that everybody can do. And I've met people who were introverts who are lobbyists, who were extroverts. Obviously, like that's kind of what you have in your mind is like some rich extrovert, like throwing cash around. I've met people who they just love diving into the regulatory code. I've met people who are data wonks, who are, people who with science backgrounds who transition into lobbying because they really care about this issue. And so I think that there is a lot of negativity out there, but it is a very open space. And if there's a cause that you care about, maybe you're not going to be paid $1 million for it. Very few people are paid $1 million to come and lobby. It's much lower than that. But it's a lot more open than a lot of people think. A lot of the things that you hear about lobbying is there is some truth to it, but it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of good people who are they're working their tails off to enact a vision of the future that they want to see, whether it's on the left or the right.
That's awesome.